There are a bunch of activities coming up in April this month. If you haven't done any let's talk after, if that's okay. Yeah. Well, welcome to Convocations. Today, our speaker is Professor Mark Lenz, who's a professor of Latin American history at Utah Valley University. He specializes in colonial Mexico, Central America, and the Atlantic world. He's published on indigenous African relations in the 18th century, Guatemala and Belize, Jesuit translation in the and conversion in the Yucatan Peninsula, and Creole and African descent literacy in indigenous languages. He won the 2018 Best Article Award at the RMCLAS, and his book Murder in Merida in 1792 was published in 2018 by the University of New Mexico Press. Professor Lenz was also the 2015-2016 David Parsons Fellow at the John Carter Brown Library in Providence, Rhode Island, next to Brown University, and he earned his PhD from the University of Tulane in 2009. Today he's going to be talking about his new book project that he's working on, and his presentation is titled No More Malinces, Why Female Interpreters Disappeared After the Conquest. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Eric, and it sounds like everybody can hear me. I can hear my echo. Thank you to Eric, also known as Professor Freeman, for inviting me to campus to give a talk. This is my first time at Snow College, and appropriately, while I was driving south on I-15, I hit a snowstorm, so I guess that's auspicious as well. And it's not perfect weather, so maybe that incentivizes you to be inside, or maybe it actually was a deterrent and you had to get through some snow to get here. But in addition to thanking Professor Freeman for bringing me here today, I'd also like to thank all of you for showing up on less than stellar conditions. So when the Spaniards arrived, they arrived to, let me go ahead and show you the map. This area, Yucatan, was one of the first mainland areas, and here's to give you a sense in comparison to the United States, where we're going to be talking about today. And then the first couple of expeditions before Cortez, and just to sort of gauge what I'm talking about and how well you're familiar with some of the big world events, how many of you are familiar with Hernán Cortez's expedition, Fernando Cortez, whatever you want to call him? All right, Cortez's conquest of Mexico. There were a couple of important expeditions before that, and what I kind of want you to think about too is, I almost set up captions and subtitles, which I do not wish to do. Oops. All right, please ignore the captions and subtitles. I didn't intend to do this, but we're gonna have captioned and subtitled talk today. All right, so this is the first expedition I'm going to talk about in 1518. When Spaniards arrived, they found a woman who was held by local Mayas, and she gave the Spanish conquistadors some of their earliest accounts of the Mayas of Yucatan. Now, she actually spoke 2 indigenous languages, including one familiar to the Spaniards in the expedition, so she became one of the first translators in this encounter with colonial Mexico. Now, these Spanish marauders immediately recognized her potential as an intermediary, and they sent her to try to initiate contact with the Mayas in the interior. But she left with the Spaniards as they continued their journey around the Gulf of Mexico, as you can kind of maybe not see here. Well, you can see up there on the map. Now, I haven't named her because her name remains lost to history. She's only mentioned as a woman from the Caribbean. Unlike Malitzin, and here I kind of want to ask you if you're familiar with this earlier interpreter. Has anybody in the room ever heard of Malitzin, or Malinche, as she's often referred to in Mexico? All right, a couple of you then. So, unlike Malitzin, who was part of Cortez's much better known expedition the following year, she only appears very briefly in the historical record. Noted in Diaz del Castillo, and he's one of the first chroniclers of all of these expeditions. And this pales in comparison to Malitzin. And here you see Malitzin, many books written about her in English and Spanish. She also appears in many of the codices that the indigenous people wrote about their own history in as well. However, Malitzin is often treated as this sort of singular figure, but there are many experiences like her that echo through the conquest of Latin America and North America as well. Being a captive woman interpreter, and then later as a captive interpreter, translating and mediating between the indigenous people of the Americas and, on the other hand, the indigenous people who already lived there. So one of the big questions then, because my book that I'm working on spans the entirety of the colonial period, and one of the questions that I have is, why are there all these female interpreters at the beginning of the conquest, but then later, after the Spanish established their rule, and they have court interpreters and church interpreters and Inquisition interpreters, there are no females after that point? So that's what I'm hoping to answer with this 30 to 40 minute presentation that I'm going to give to you today. Now, this woman that we have been talking about, and I would love to give her a name, but I can't because she's not named anywhere, spoke la lengua de la isla de Jamaica, the language of the island of Jamaica, which was probably Taíno. Now, some of the Spaniards who had accompanied Juan de Grijalva actually had learned one of the indigenous languages, Taíno, and they were able to communicate with her. And according to Diaz del Castillo, who gives the primary version of events around her, she actually had survived. She was the sole survivor of a shipwreck of a group of indigenous people from the Caribbean who got washed up in a storm onto Yucatan's shores. According to Diaz del Castillo, the rest of her cohort were sacrificed, and she was the only one left. So her brief appearance in this chronicle ends with her departure from Yucatan in the company of Grijalva, and it's just, and I'm quoting here, "And the Indian from Jamaica left with us, and we continued our journey." That's it, just this very fleeting appearance in the historical record. Now, she and Malitzin and many other women that we're going to examine, a few of them briefly here, were able to parlay their linguistic abilities to actually join the Spaniards and find a place for them in the conquest. Now, as I sort of mentioned earlier, we don't know what happened to her. Did she marry a Spaniard? Did she return back to Jamaica? No idea. Now, Malitzin, by contrast, is absolutely, and I kind of asked if anybody had heard of her as a point of reference. She's appeared in multiple scholarships, or multiple original documents from the time, both indigenous authored and the Spanish accounts of their own conquests, as well as multiple monographs. And just in case any of you are totally enthralled by the idea of this female interpreter, I have up here a picture of the best book that I would say on Malitzin, Malitzin's Choices by Camille Townsend. Now, Malitzin and the woman that I mentioned and did not name their experiences were actually fairly commonplace. There's an article by Scott Cave bringing it a little bit closer to home, but not too far from the Caribbean, about a woman named Madalena, who actually was a key interpreter in one of the early and failed Spanish attempts to colonize Florida. So she actually was captured during De Soto's expedition. All right, so this is where we getting into U.S. history a little bit. Has anybody heard of the DeSoto expedition at least? I'm looking at our U.S. historian here to see what he's been teaching. But this was an early 16th century expedition. So DeSoto died, and she actually made her way to Havana, and there was a kind of strangely named Dominican friar, Luis Cancer, that's his real name, and they relied on her linguistic abilities when he attempted to return to Florida in 1549. Now, Cancer was martyred. What do I mean by that? He's dead. And she was kind of left behind in Florida. And apparently, unlike some of the previous figures that we've examined earlier, she actually did manage to return to live among her people. Now, farther to the south, kind of at the other end of the greater Caribbean, if we want to call it that, women also played a prominent role as interpreters in South America. Now, I'm a little bit surprised that nobody had heard of Malintzin, but unless you're actually from Colombia, there's not a good chance that you've heard of La India Catalina. Now, I don't expect as many hands this time, but has anybody heard of this woman simply known as La India Catalina? Nope. She gets a lot of coverage in Spanish scholarship. For some reason, despite a lot of parallels between her and Malintzin or Malinche, not much coverage whatsoever of her in English. So she also played a key role and had an experience that was similar to the three previous women that we've just mentioned. 1509, she was captured from her homeland in northern Colombia by Diego Nicuesa. Similarly, she was taken to a Caribbean island more densely populated and thoroughly settled by Spaniards. In this case, it was Santo Domingo. She learned Spanish fluently, and then later, in 1533, Pedro de Heredia recruited her to serve as the intermediary during his 1533 expedition to Cartagena, where you actually see this statue commemorating her role. This doesn't look like Snow College because it's not. It's a Caribbean port. She also became the mistress of Heredia, similar to Malintzin before her, although there was probably some element of coercion. It's a little bit likely, it's highly likely, in fact, that this wasn't entirely voluntary. Why do I say that? Well, one of the records that we have of her, and there is a bigger documentary trail for her than some of these that I've mentioned, is that he was brought before a Spanish court for some of his misdeeds in the conquest of this area, and she testified against him. She was actually a key witness against the man who was the father of her children and the leader of the expedition that she participated in. All right, now, Susan Kellogg, who worked briefly on this and actually gave me a lot of leads to follow up, in a single footnote, and just a little tiny footnote in her book, found at least 3 additional women. For those of you, and this is, if anybody's interested, as close as we're going to get to Utah, Don Juan de Oñate. Anybody from New Mexico, or has anybody spent any time in New Mexico during your life? Nope, okay. Well, it's a state over, so it's not that far away, but Don Juan de Oñate, and I kind of got creative. You don't actually see him in this image. This is, in the recent monuments issue, there's a Don Juan de Oñate monument, and they actually took his statue away. So you see this empty statue. You also can see sort of the expedition. During his expedition, he actually wrote down that he wanted to find a second Malintzin. So there's a reason why I keep referring to Malintzin. She's the one who is most widely known. And during his expedition to New Mexico, he found a woman from a little bit farther south than the New Mexico area that we know, Taos, Santa Fe, Albuquerque. Hopefully you know that sort of area. Unfortunately, and one thing is notable about Malintzin, she was remarkably good at learning languages. She knew at least 4 languages, 2 of which she actually learned while accompanying Cortez's expedition. This woman, Doña Inez, wasn't as much into learning different languages, and moreover, who has any background on New Mexican history? If you raise your hand, I'm not going to call you out or put you at too much risk, but, and I can even look at the professors here, what would make a translator's life so difficult about New Mexico? You can't just translate between one indigenous language and one Pueblo languages. The Pueblos, all concentrated in one area, speak 4 main languages with a few more smaller minority languages. So even if you wanted a second Malinche, there was a reason that wasn't going to happen, and that is because it's just too difficult. All right, so going on to some more interpreters, we're going to go a little bit farther away to Brazil. Has anybody ever been to Brazil? Nope. Sometimes when I'm teaching Latin American history at Utah Valley University, there's a lot of people who've done their missions down there, so occasionally there's some familiarity. Another important author, Alida Metcalf, actually noticed that the French Jesuits, who knew that the French were in Brazil? I always kind of forget this, but the French tried to displace the Portuguese, and they set up some missions up in the north where the Portuguese wouldn't notice them. They also relied on an indigenous woman, and they did so with some success. They actually convinced the Tupi in the area to move closer to where they were setting up their mission. The only problem with this is that the Portuguese, shortly after that, kicked out the French, and we don't actually know the end of the story for this woman, but it's pretty likely that she would have been enslaved by the Portuguese, who liked to enslave indigenous people during that time. All right, so if I was, I kind of gave you the answer there, but if I was going to ask you to name one guide or intermediary or interpreter, and I do want to see if any of the students can answer, from the United States history, from the U.S. West, who would you name? Sacagawea, yep. Somebody's at least paying attention to the slideshow. So it's not only Spanish contexts where we actually see women as key participants in this expedition. Sacagawea, of course, is the best known one, with her accompanying Lewis and Clark and their trip west. Now, what kind of stood out to me, because I didn't go all over the map, is that there were at least 3 indigenous women who were interpreters among the Iroquois. Now, they stand out because at least 2 of these women, Rebecca Kellogg, a woman named, and she was actually European descent, Madame Montour and Hilati van Olinda, the last 2 actually served as official appointed interpreters, not just guides and intermediaries working in an informal way along one of these exploratory expeditions. They were appointed government interpreters, which is fairly rare, as we're going to see. Now, there's a few world history students in this class, so for them, I also looked in a few other cases, Muslim Africa, the Mediterranean, and in those areas of contact, there were not female interpreters. So I found a lot of female interpreters, but not everywhere where I have looked for them. And to be honest, I'm not a European or African historian, so maybe I just haven't looked hard enough. So why were all of these indigenous women serving in Latin America specifically? Part of it was the way in which the contact happened. You didn't have Ottomans and Europeans on relatively equal footing. You had Spaniards going in there with superior force and capturing interpreters as well. And also, there was sort of a Mesoamerican tradition where if somebody defeated you, if there's 2 Mesoamerican polities of war, let's say the Aztecs, because you're familiar with them, and maybe the Zapotecs who you're not, if the Aztecs defeated another major city-state, they had to give people in tribute. And so Malintzin had actually come from central Mexico, more central Mexico, down to the Gulf area, where she actually learned another indigenous language. Here's some of the early interpreters there. Sort of notice that they're kind of along the coast where the Spaniards were operating. When they'd have skirmishes with these Maya people who were already there, they would either capture indigenous women or they'd be given indigenous women, as in the case of Malintzin, and then they would put them to work as interpreters. Now, how many of you, let's get some hands for real here, think that it should be allowed for an empire when they expand to just go into a new territory and take slaves? No, obviously not. Now, what is unique about this and sort of lends itself to what's going on in this territory is that eventually the kings and queen of Spain, not known as humanitarians by 21st century standards by a long shot, but they did decide that, okay, we can't have Spaniards just going into a new territory, piling a bunch of people on boats and making them work for us. We've got to have some limitations on slavery. But even after there were restrictions on enslaving the native people of the Americas, they came up with this one loophole that, okay, so you can't enslave people anymore, but you can take 2 or 3 as interpreters. And so there's a loophole that even after it was abolished, you could still enslave people. I'm going to do my pretend Spanish accent here. Que los descubridores no traigan indios si no fueran para intérpretes. That means you can't take people anymore. You can't just go in and random capture people and force them to work for you. But for interpreters, yeah, you can actually do that. So going back to this one. Now in this case specifically of Yucatan, John Chuchak identified 12 people who were brought in. Now, does that mean there were only 12 interpreters during this very long process of contact and conquest with Yucatan? No, but it meant that during the conquest period, they only named apparently 12. And John Chuchak has researched this period extensively. So many of them, of course, were brought on as through coercion, through giving of a subjugated group to the Spaniards, some people, but for the most part, they were coerced. You have the sort of exception of the Jamaican woman at the very beginning of this talk that I mentioned. She absolutely voluntarily translated. You had others who sort of rejoined. This is an interesting case, and I'm only going to mention it in passing because I think, I'm looking at my time here, Jeronimo de Aguilar. Now, he'd actually had a very similar experience to the Jamaican woman. He'd actually been with a group of Spaniards who washed up on the shores of Yucatan. Really interesting story is that he was one of 2 survivors. He did everything he could to rejoin the Spaniards. When Cortez arrived, he had a counterpart, Jeronimo de Aguilar. I can't talk about him too much, but he actually refused to rejoin the Spaniards. And in the wars between the Mayas and the Spaniards that followed over the next decades, he was on the side of the Mayas. But we're not going to talk about him. We're going to talk about Jeronimo de Aguilar, who did play a key role voluntarily. And what is interesting is that we know so much more about him because his daughter, Luisa de Aguilar, wrote down his merits and deeds, certainly exaggerated. Now, he's translating a little bit of basic, saying if anybody's attention, if he's translating in 1519, and she calls him the first interpreter of the America, that's not correct. There had actually been multiple interpreters before that, but he had the advantage of a literate daughter who wrote down his entire history, embellished it quite a bit, forgot the fact that he only translated in tandem with Malintzin, basically Spanish to Yucatec Maya to Malintzin, Malintzin then communicating in Nahuatl until she learned Spanish as well very quickly en route. And he actually became irrelevant by the time Cortez's expedition was done. Obviously, as I mentioned, Malintzin had a much more important impact, even though she didn't have any descendants of her own to write down her account. So here's a couple of early Maya translators as well. So what I've mentioned is we have multiple examples of female interpreters throughout the records of early contact, from the Iroquois up in New York and the border with Canada, all the way down to Brazil. So why is it, with the exception of those 2 Iroquois women, did they not become institutional translators? Why didn't they become translators for the colonial courts, or translators for the missionaries, or who would want this job, but translators for the Inquisition, because that also did exist? The real easy reason is that after this conquest, what you have is Franciscans. So during this early colonial contact period, what you have is oral translation, people communing back and forth, verbally speaking, And what you have, in the case of Yucatan at least, is that the next generation of translators had to translate between written documents in the European language and written documents in the Maya and Aztec languages, as well as other languages. And did the Franciscans like having girls in their school? Absolutely not. Yeah, I've talked to some people, and I've sort of presented roughly on this in a shorter and far less polished. And the most obvious answer is, well, European patriarchal norms prevented women from becoming interpreters. And I was like, okay, I think we need a little more detail than that. What it actually consists of is the education of another generation of indigenous elites, and that was completely restricted to boys. Now, John Chuchak, who I've mentioned before, as well as William Hanks, have really looked at the development of a literate group of Mayas after the conquest. Little bit of side note that's relevant here. There's probably 4,000 to 5,000 colonial documents written in the European alphabet, but in the Maya language, and the vast majority of them are written by men. Why? Because the Franciscans, one of the first things they did when they got there was they'd set up schools. And when they set up these schools, they taught everybody, all of the children, catechism, but some of the students stayed on, learned more, kind of got the equivalent of a high school or college education, and they were all boys. So both Hanks and Chuchak have kind of looked at this education, so I'm kind of like, oh yeah, they were, I want to read this off. The muchachos de la escuela. So 1550s, 1560s, they were all the boys of the school. Even women from prominent families from the Maya, Mayas had their own set of nobility. Noble girls would not have learned. Noble boys absolutely would have learned. And as the colonial era moved on, literacy as well as fluency in both Maya and Spanish became more important. You didn't have people like Malintzin, who actually knew 2 Maya languages, 1 Central Mexican language, and Spanish. They became less important over time. So now this wasn't, as we might think, due to a conscious decision of the Franciscans, well, who should we teach? It had more to do with their rule. So if we talk about Franciscans, and I call them friars, they are distinguished from run-of-the-mill priests and bishops because they live according to a rule. And that rule severely restricted any type of contact that they could possibly have with women or girls. And so I'm mocking them a tiny bit here, but they basically like, okay, so we'll teach everybody, and then we'll send the girls home and the plebe home. That's kind of the common people. And then we'll only teach the elite boys. And that was based in part on the regula bulata, or the Franciscan rule. So kind of to wrap up, what you have then is this new generation of Maya translators, Gaspar Antonio Chi, Jorge Shu, those are Maya last names, by the way, Diego Na, Jorge Canuel, and this is some of the many early Maya languages, as they were called, who translated on behalf of the Franciscans, and later, in some cases, on behalf of the governors and the conquistadors. And there are no more Malintzins among their rank. So why is this again? You know, Malintzin, who I've alluded to several times, as well as the Jamaican woman, they demonstrated a certain capacity to translate quite well, to mediate. You know, if you think about the Brazilian translator, whose name we don't even know, she convinced a group of indigenous people to move closer to the Jesuit mission. Now, it's worth remarking on contemporary traditions. A much smaller project that I'm working on is one chapter in a book called Interpreters in the West. Yucatan's not the West, but they let me in anyway, so thank you to them. A much more relevant chapter by Taylor Cousins, who's actually both a court interpreter and a historian of translation, noted that in modern-day California, who do you think composes the majority of translators in courts in modern-day California? Hispanic women. So it's not sort of this lack of aptitude as much as cultural circumstances. So in conclusion, Malitzin and the unnamed India de Jamaica, and that's all we know her as, are emblematic of the captive men and women who translated for the Spanish marauders in the earliest years of the Yucatec Maya's encounter with European invaders. They joined, I'm going to go back to the map here, they joined the Spaniards at opposite ends. The Jamaican women joined the expedition in the eastern half of the peninsula, and then Malitzin actually joined them. I'm going to try one more time. Ooh, there we go. Right around here. And they were fluent in multiple indigenous language. Malitzin spoke Chontal Maya, Yucatec Maya, Nahuatl, and also then learned Spanish. The Jamaican women knew Taino as well as Yucatec Maya. But despite their prominent role, they've been relegated to near anonymity. Many women, often only identified by a first name, if anything at all, proliferated among the translators, but few of them are known today. And I think I am right at 35 minutes, so now's the time where I'd welcome questions and answers as well.
So for the live stream, we want to make sure if you ask a question that we have a microphone for you before. So why don't, so maybe right now, maybe take a minute or two to, you can talk to people next to you and maybe think up of questions you might want to ask while we have TAs come with the microphones. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was fascinating, especially because I'm a historian, so of course I liked it, and I study women's history. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more why you think it was women in particular who have been inclined to be interpreters at this point. And I was wondering if women were more commonly sent as tribute.
Yes.
But then also you mentioned that modern day California, its women tend to be the predominant interpreters in courts. So I wondered if there's something that's unique to females in general that they would be more inclined to do that. Yeah. Or if you could explain a little bit more why women rather than men.
So for the time period I'm focusing on, and I'm more secure answering the first part of your question because I'm not a modern, I don't get into 20th century and 21st century as much. Absolutely. You know, every time the Spaniards would meet with an indigenous group, have a little skirmish with them, women were given. Yeah, there's a couple of, I decided to keep this right at 35 minutes out of consideration for you being here on a Thursday afternoon. But there's a couple parts I skipped. And men also, if you look up here, men were captured. You have sort of Pero Barba, Melchor, Julian. They were all actually captured in skirmishes and then brought back to the Caribbean or even Spain, and then where they learned Spanish and were brought back as forced interpreters. Now, forced interpreters, there's an issue with that as well, because if you're a forced interpreter, what are you going to do the first time you have a chance when the Spaniards are not looking? Run away and rejoin your people, and that's what Melchor did. His counterpart, Julian, another interpreter, actually died of Spanish diseases, which was fairly common as well. Women tended to be given, and I think that idea that, you know, the people who you had lived with voluntarily gave you away tended to lead to more loyalty. I mean, when her little turn at translating was over for the Jamaican woman, she left with the Spaniards. Malitzin spent the rest of her life in the company of Cortez and then later one of his lieutenants. So there was this, there absolutely was a tradition where women would be, large groups of women would be given as sort of recognition of, and this is a little bit uncomfortable, but one group subjugates another, and so you give 20 to 10 to however many women primarily as gifts to the Spaniards. And that continued a Mesoamerican tradition too before that. That had been the case in the wars between Aztecs and Zapotecs, or different groups of Mayas having war against each other. That was part and parcel. Now, there are some interesting studies. I'm a little bit shakier on knowing good information from bad information on this, but there's been really interesting studies into cognition and translation. And Collard Camille and Bart de Franck, who are much more into the modern translation studies than I am outside of history. Actually looked at a lot of cognitive tests, so this is answering the second part of your question, and noted measurable female advantages in verbal fluency, generating synonyms, and if you're going to translate, how many of you need to generate synonyms? Well, maybe a little bit because you don't want to bore your professor with the same word over and over again. But generally speaking, that's a specific case where the ability to know a lot of different words and translate is important, and faster processing speed. So that's possibly part of it too. But I think there also might be cultural factors where women are seen as more trusted intermediaries also. So that is off the cuff, just sort of a cultural observation. Okay, that was a long answer, so now you've had, some of you hopefully had the time to think of some questions.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, it seems like some of this stuff would be pretty hard to dig up.
Yeah.
So it's like way back in history.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering how you do your research, because I'm sure Google would not get these kind of, wouldn't tell you this kind of stuff, so.
How do I do my research? One thing that I'm going to show you here is that I had to learn to read, old documents. So, and I have to travel, as if that's a bad thing. But you basically, if you're researching Latin America during the colonial period, you'll end up spending at least some of your time in Spain, where they have their colonial imperial archives. And if you want a little more detail, you basically start with the 18th century, which is the 1700s, because if you know Spanish, you can read that, and then you kind of work your way backwards until finally you are able to read these 16th century documents. And they're pretty well cataloged and organized, so yeah, as long as you sort of learn the background of the history, you can figure out where these documents are going to be at. Yeah, the Patronato is the section that has the accounts of conquistadors and their descendants, and most of them are purely conquistadors, but sometimes they'll mention, and we had this interpreter there, or as in the case of Luisa de Aguilar, or another guy that I'm kind of interested, Alonso de Arevalo, they'll mention their translation work on behalf of the conquistadors too. For the later period that I'm not talking about as much, it's criminal cases. You have interpreters. I was telling Professor Freeman right before this, I don't want my next book to be 600 pages, so I'm focusing purely on criminal courts and translators after the early conquest period. And so you look at criminal documents, and you have two people come in, one person speaking Maya, one person speaking Spanish, and they take their testimony. More mundane things that get a little less exciting, like somebody dies without a will, and you bring in witnesses, so civil documents as well. I also spend quite a bit of time in Mexico City because that's where the major national archives are, as well as Yucatan. Has anybody been to Cancun or Playa del Carmen or any of those areas? Yucatan, yeah. It's hot, it's sweaty, and I spent less, even though I'm writing about Yucatan, I spent less time there because the documents corrode. If you don't have much before the 18th century because the documents there are in really bad shape. So that's kind of, does that answer your question, or do you have any follow-ups that you want to, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Questions? While you're thinking of one, I have a question. So what do you think, I'm just wondering, like, not present day, the influence on interpreters or anything, but right after where you end, like what's the long-term legacy of this change that you have noticed? Does this influence, I don't know, does this influence more that comes into, I don't know, 17th, 18th centuries, whatnot?
Really big picture answer to that is what you have in the case of Yucatan and other Maya societies is that it's primarily male leaders. But if you get well out of my time area into the classic period, 300 to 900 AD, you had more women who were also rulers. You had a mostly male elite class, but a few women rulers who are commemorated on stela. What you have after 1550 basically is no prominent women leaders. I'm going to be as quick as possible because this is for Eric. There's a really good book on colonial caciques, or cacicas, women leaders throughout colonial Latin America. And the authors of this anthology said, do you have a chapter? I was like, I have not run into a single cacica for this entire time period for the people that I'm studying. There's one exception to that, but that's after a 19th century, 1800s revolt, and they push out the Spanish-influenced people. And in Tulum, of all places, there's somebody who's referred to as the Queen of Tulum, but that's only after they push the Spanish out. So basically, you have this, a indigenous descent local elite that only has prominent male figures. That's the long-standing legacy of this. Not just translators, but caciques, notaries, etc.
All right, so why don't we give, well, first of all, if you have questions that maybe you didn't want to ask in front of everybody else, I know that Dr. Lenz is willing to hang out here, or if you have questions for me or anything, we'll be around for a few more minutes. Otherwise, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Lenz.